Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond. Be sure to hit like and subscribe so people can find the channel. And today we are joined by Berke Brown. Welcome, Berke.
Hey, Ben. Happy to be here as always, man. Really excited for our conversation today.
Absolutely, man. Last week was a great one. So today I want to talk about failure zones and 5 habits that really limit our success and happiness. And we're all guilty of it at some point in our lives, for sure. And I was reading a quote from Lao Tzu that said, "Mastery of the world is achieved by letting things take their natural course. You cannot master the world by changing the natural way." So let's discuss 5 habits that change the natural flow and bring chaos really into our lives. And sometimes I think we think it brings a lot of joy in our lives, but as we go through this, I think we'll quickly realize and be able to identify some of these sort of, I wouldn't call them recipes for success, but certainly potential recipes for failures in our lives. So the first one, what I'd call the failure zone, is trying to please everyone, right? The idea that, trying to please everyone is really rooted in fear and rejection. And so we go about trying to figure out the angle of a person so we're not rejected at some level, or we don't have the fear of loss in that relation. So, however, this disease to please makes people sick, for sure. I remember in businesses where I've seen people do it, or I've been guilty of it with bosses trying to get to that next level, and you're just in an uncertain place. And really, promotion is certainly political, but certainly it has a lot to do with competence and skills. And sometimes when you're a young gun and you're trying to go for the promotions and be a fast burner, right? Sometimes we kind of get ahead of our skill sets and creates a lot of internal stress. So pleasing everyone seems to be the answer, the safe way to inoculate yourself against conflict, confrontation, relationships, whether it be family, friends, or work. So in your research, how is trying to please everyone not effective?
Yeah, you know what? There's a great quote. You can please all the people some of the time, some of the people all the time, but you cannot please all the people all the time. And I believe this to be absolutely true. And the truth is that if we know that we can't please everybody all the time, to attempt to do it is a form of insanity, right? We're putting ourselves in a position to where we're trying our hardest to truly become everything to everyone. And the reason that it becomes a failure, the reason that it costs us, is that in order for me to be what I believe you want me to be, I cannot be myself, right? I must fundamentally put myself into a position in where I am contorting my own person into being what the other person expects. And the problem is that if we live our lives that way, we cannot get to what's called flow. Flow is when you are living from a place of pure internal motivation. It's that space where you are so connected to the work that you do. You find so much satisfaction in it that you would do this work without pay because you believe in it so much. When you're in that space, you are living completely from your values. You are living completely from your own authenticity. You are living completely from who you are as a person, right? And so the goal is for you to live from that space. But as soon as I tilt, bend, break, contort, twist, reshape myself into something that is not authentic, I do not have internal motivation. All I have then is external motivation. And external motivation is only based on reward or punishment. And that only lasts for so long. They did research and found out that students who are externally motivated, that would get paid to get good grades versus had the classes facilitated in a way to where they felt more engaged and competent, the ones who were doing it for the pay just lost interest after a while. The same way with us. We have to make sure that we're being our authentic selves, because if we show up and it makes our bosses happy, that means that we're in a good company. But if we show up and it makes our bosses suppress us, the question isn't not what must I do to change internally. It's what must I do to get out of this job and find a job that I really love?
That's a good point. So it almost feels like if you're a people pleaser, it's an identity crisis in the making. And in the idea that we try to promote, get promoted, make more money, at least in the corporate sense, by people pleasing, it would seem to me that could really truncate your progression, right? Because if it's built on my relationship versus competency, that's probably problematic, especially as you go higher in the organization. That's the whole concept behind the Peter Principle, right? We have people we know, we have relationships. There's fiefdoms, there's kingdoms, there's whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And the reality is people are promoted per the Peter Principle to the level of incompetence because they have been more focused on the relationship building, maybe the butt kissing, whatever you want to call it, as opposed to sheer competence. Now, having said that, I wouldn't argue that it's not, it's clearly important to go along at some levels to get along with people, to be able to work with and through people in an organization to be effective. But there's a fine line between just the pure political play, right, people pleasing, and the competence. There has to be a balance, certainly. And it seems to me as you move up the higher levels of an organization, competence rules out.
You know, it's the dance is between people pleasing and emotional intelligence, really, at the end of the day. If I'm people pleasing, that means I'm changing who I am fundamentally. That like myself is showing up different than how I really am. But emotional intelligence is kind of how where you're saying relationships, and relationships make sense because you want to be able to have relationships. When you're in a place where you're engaging in a relationship, where you are finding out what the values and needs are of the person that you're working with and for. If I'm a manager, for the people that I'm managing, I have to know emotionally what their drivers are, because then I can maneuver the way that I do the work, the way that I promote them, the way that I give them tasks in a way that ties to what their values are. So they feel like they're a part of the community, they're part of the team. In the same way as I'm looking up for management to more of the executive level, my boss, I have to be thinking about what is it that they are driven by? What drives them? Once I find out what drives them and I find out how to communicate in a way that is their language, well then at that point, what I'm doing is I'm pleasing them by speaking in their language, but not by changing who I am fundamentally. If I learn a different language, when I speak that language, my personality will still be in the way that I speak. It'll just be a different language. What we're trying to say is don't dress up as something that you're not. Be you, dress up the way that you are, learn as many languages as possible, because that can get you to kind of be more mobile when it comes up the ladder of success, but never allow it to erase your authenticity. All you want to do is you want to be able to speak in their language, understand emotionally what drives them, and then from there you'll find your way moving up the ladder while maintaining who you are.
Great points. And I think there's the business side and there's the personal side, right?
Right.
And again, trying to please everybody in the personal side in a relationship sense, right? You meet that incredible person, the person of your dreams, and some people go right in that mode of how do I please them to get them to like me more, right? And it seems to me that some of the characteristics of a people pleaser in a relationship is you attract less people because they know you're not authentic, right? And it's sort of, you come across as loving yourself less, right? It's whatever I have to do to get this person to like me. To that person, it's going to feel like, as this person sure of themselves, right? And also allows you to be perceived as becoming, being perceived as more manipulative, right? Because I'm trying to find that angle in the relationship, certainly in a company setting, of how to get what I want, right? I get what I want when I want, right? So I think the other thing it does, a couple more things, is it makes you look less confident. And ultimately, over time, you're going to have less friends, right? Because I think people really want authentic, real people, certainly in relationships. And I think that's a challenge. I was talking to a guy, one of my partners, he's out of Florida, and he said, I was down in Texas, in Dallas, and he says, there's some amazing people down there, and there's really a lot of bright people. He goes, but for me, it felt very surfacey, the interaction, that it was very gloss, the 8.5 by 10 glossy. And he goes, they're amazing people, but I just didn't connect because I didn't know what the real was. And so it seems to me that when you're people pleasing and doing things cosmetically or otherwise, not that that's bad, by the way, but if the end goal is pure that, I think what we end up projecting is something less than we would hope for.
Yeah, it's so it's intense because our society is built off consumerism, which is this constant belief that I'm not enough unless I purchase fill in the blank. I had a client of mine who, beautiful, talented, skilled, incredible woman. But before we started the program, everything that she was trying to be was what she thought the world wanted her to be. Beautiful, intelligent, funny. Even her relationship with her father always wanted her to be successful. And so what happened was she created this narrative of who she's supposed to be. And she carved it out and she chiseled it down with like a fine-tooth chisel, just was able to understand exactly what it was that she was supposed to be. And she did all that she could to fit into that space and thought she was happy because she thought she was supposed to be happy if she became that. All the diets, she did all the diets, she would exercise, starve herself, all the things that every, woman kind of is pressured to do with, at least in this Western society, if not the world. She contorted into those spaces. And what happened when we did our work was that we started to let her see who she really was, what she really loved, and that she had been wasting so much cognitive space trying to look the part that she couldn't be herself. And then she had to kind of almost have this interesting experience where she's like, who am I if I'm not the stories that everybody said and that I thought I was supposed to be? And it's a very scary place to become authentic, to break open this kind of open Pandora's box of who you are and really experience your own emotions, your own thoughts, your own perspectives. But as she did that, she began to realize how much happier she was as this person. She's like, this is the person I was before my trauma when I was younger. that freedom allowed her to build these new relationships since then that are so much more deep and authentic. And it's funny because now when she looks with the eyes that she has now to the relationship she had before, she's like, those were pathetic. Those were shallow. And even though the numbers were great, the quality was so little. The depth was so non-existent. And so when she was able to see that, she was able to connect in a more meaningful way with people. She got to understand what relationships looked like in a way that she never experienced them before. And yes, it's not controlled, because you'll feel emotions that you didn't even know you had because you've been suppressing them because you're supposed to look a certain or act a certain way. But the freedom that you gain when you break open, the authenticity, the way that you can show up and find things that resonate with your values, it sets you on a path to true success defined by your own spirit. That's the win that we're all aiming for, to not try to define and become the success that society tells us, because at that point, we're just contortionists.
No, that's really well said. And I tell you, it's challenging, right? Because when the idea of people pleasing is, I want certainty. I
Right,
want to know that the sky's blue when I wake up in the morning. I want to know that I have a bed when I, go home at night. I want that certainty in my
absolutely.
relationships in my life. And oftentimes for a lot of people, people are codependent. There's a lot of dynamics going on. And so the idea of being able to stand on your own and not focus on the people pleasing, to be sure of who you are.
Right,
Because the other side of that is, if a person thinks that, hey, if I don't play that game or that role, then what's the alternative to people pleasing? Will I lose everybody? Will I lose all my friends? Am I good enough? Am I
right.
smart enough? Am I funny enough? Will they accept me for who I am? And so I think there's a lot of psychodynamics going on in those
Yeah,
decisions where people play that game. And it could be, I people please because I want to get to a certain level, or I want certain people in my life, or I need that fundamental support, because if not, my whole world will fall apart.
mm,
So I would imagine it's very dynamic, that whole concept. But I think from a construct standpoint, certainly better not to be in the people pleasing category. And I think the bottom line is, the opinion of others don't really matter. It's really about focusing on your dreams, right? Because if I'm focusing on the dreams of others or the opinions of others, it's like a punch drunk fighter, right? They're just getting hit
yeah,
from every side. And every
absolutely.
punch is a direction of where you're supposed to go, in a sense, right? And
Yeah, it's
that's a
interesting.
tough way to live life.
It's hard, man. And the funny thing is it's not only just like what other people are thinking. The truth is, this is how we sabotage ourselves so much. This is how we are masters of our own universe, and we totally give it away. But it's not even what they're thinking about me most often. It's what I think they're thinking about me. And so what happens is, there's them, and then there's the projection that I place upon them that is sourced from me. And that projection comes upon them, and then I imagine them projecting back to me. So it's this double projection of forcing me to be something I'm not, but I'm the source of it, right? It's our ability to put onto people what we think they say that we're supposed to be, more so often than the people, their own thoughts about us. And so being able to break that is freedom. Being able to be a slave to that is failure.
Well said, Berke. Another epic habit of the failure zone, which kind of leads to what you were saying, is talking negatively about yourself and to yourself, right? And so your self-talk is a reflection of where you want to, what you want to become. So
Right.
when you speak negatively about yourself, you become a negative person. And basically negative self-talk, right? Self-talk, or any inner dialogue you have with yourself, may be limiting your ability to believe in yourself and your own abilities and to reach your potential. It's sort of firm grasp on the obvious. So this
Right.
idea of how we think about things, how we talk to ourselves, based on our upbringing, based on the people we're around, is really important. So in your research and studies, what have you come across as the negative consequences of self-talk?
Right, right. This is my work, man. This is the heart of my work. According to the National Science Foundation, they say we have about 12,000 to 60,000 negative thoughts per day. They say that 80% of our thinking, okay, 80% of our thoughts are negative thoughts about us. And 95% of that 80% is repetitive thoughts, not even new thoughts of negativity. It's repetitive thoughts. And a belief, in essence, is just a thought repeated over time. When you think a thought over and over and over and over again, it becomes a belief. And then when it becomes a belief, it has this kind of mind of its own. We start to enact and we start to live out what that belief dictates. If the belief says I'm not good enough, then when opportunity to become good enough is there, we can't go against that belief. So what happens is we find a way to sabotage. So the negative thought kind of syndrome is something that's it's natural to us to a certain extent. If you think about, let's say we'll go back before the modern society that we had, when we're living life or death and we're in a place where we're like searching for our meal, right? We're on the plains and we're saying, okay, we have to take out this animal, right? Or this tribe is about to come and attack us. fight or flight was real back then. Everything was a threat. By nature, we're supposed to be aware of all the negative things because that equals death if we're not aware of it. Being aware of the happy things, that's not as important because you can live without happiness. But threat, you can't live with threat, because if threat's there, you have to be able to fight or flight. So what happens is we now put ourselves back in this modern society. We're in this modern society where there is no true threat, like constantly there. So our mind starts to begin to find threats. And so it looks for threats, and then it starts to attack itself. And so the negative thoughts start to repeat. We start to say what we can and can't do. Society tells us that you're supposed to be this way, but we want to be this way. So if we're doing that, we're going against society, and we just build up that snowball as it rolls down the mountain. You see, these negative thoughts that we dictate, that we say, that we pour towards ourselves are actually what stop us from taking leaps in our lives. They stop us from taking risks. They cause us to pull our punches. And a lot of times when I'm talking with my clients, they have opportunities for success, but before they can fully extend, they pull their punch because they're afraid they're going to break their hand. And the truth is that we have to find a way to understand why these negative thoughts are there, what sourced beliefs are causing them, and then eradicate them. Because when you eradicate them, then you can punch with full force. The problem is we aren't even aware of the thoughts that we have. We aren't even aware of how often we're beating ourselves up. And so we wonder why we're not successful. We haven't done the work to analyze what's going on in our heads.
It kind of feels like it's behaviors and patterns, right? We talked about this before. You're tuning that frequency in, right? Sometimes
Right.
it's a super positive frequency. Sometimes it's super negative. Sometimes it's full of just drama. And I think certain people are drawn to certain aspects, probably perhaps based on their childhood, but it's tuning in that frequency. And sometimes we're not aware of it, right? We come in this mindset, right, where we look at a challenge and we tell ourselves all the reasons we can't do it, or why it's not going to happen, right?
Right.
And I think what that produces is anxiety and depression. We look at the United States and the number of people on anti-anxiety medicines or depression, anti-depression medicines. It's epic. If you look at in terms of historical timelines, it's epic. Yeah. And so you say, why in a world in the United States, where we're the most successful superpower economically the world's ever seen, we have everything in our beck and call, for the most part, right? And certainly there's parts of society that don't, but by and large we do. Yet we have this dynamic where we're not confident, we're negative, and we're trying to cope with it. And again, I would argue that the negative self-talk really leads to depression and anxiety and stress.
Yeah. It is interesting because what's happening is, as our society is becoming more technologically advanced, as just like you said, things are at our beck and call at a higher degree, higher level, depression is increasing too. The same kind of conundrum happens with, for example, with some of the research that I did when I was talking about the intention behavior gap, where we intend to be a certain way, but there's a gap between what we actually do. Look at the fitness industry. The fitness industry, and this is the mindfulness, the health, wellness, nutrition, exercise industry. It has gone over 200% of an increase from 1992. It's about a $30 billion industry right now. But at the same time, obesity has gone up higher than it's ever been in the same amount of time. So the question is, as we spend more money, have become more knowledgeable and more aware of what makes us healthy, how is it that we're getting bigger and fatter? Like, how is that? Like, right. What is the paradox, right? How are we doing that? The same thing happens here. We have been conditioned to believe in a hyper-capitalistic society that consumption equals happiness, that there is a exact correlate to the amount of money that you have and the amount of material that you have to your happiness. But in research, they found out that after about $75,000 in this society, your happiness doesn't get better. It's like a bottle of wine. A $1 bottle of wine tastes a lot worse than a $15 bottle of wine. A 15 tastes a lot worse than a $75 bottle of wine. But as you start to climb up to the $100, $200, $300, $5,000 bottles of wine, it becomes less and less of a difference, to the point where if you gave it to certain people who claim to be connoisseurs, they wouldn't even know the difference, right? In the same way, after $75,000, happiness doesn't continue to grow. If you're poor to $75,000, your happiness increases. But after that, it's not that much. The same thing in our society. If we will constantly find ourselves believing that material equals happiness, that what I look at on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook is what I'm supposed to have, and when I have it, I'll be happy, then we are continuously chasing a void. And that void will never provide anything of sustenance. Why? Because we haven't dealt with the void within ourselves.
So you're saying those marketers are really hyper effective, right? If I can take a $15 wine and then sell it for $4,000, right? Or I
Yeah,
even make 75,000. I'm now making, 2 million, and I'm buying all this stuff, and it doesn't bring more happiness.
it
What it
doesn't.
says is the marketing, like you said earlier, and what they're pushing to get happy and to be enough and to be successful and to be perceived as that person, is really driven large part by marketing.
It's conjecture.
Yeah.
All of it. It's imbued. And when I look at an iPhone, if you look at the actual what the iPhone is, it's the Apple logo that makes the iPhone pop out, right? What happens is we have been bamboozled to believe that a logo, that an idea, it can be imbued into a product, and thus the product becomes inherently more valuable. It's just not true. It doesn't work that way. And so we do that in ourselves. We believe that, oh, I have my leather jacket. Now I am more. Now, I'm not saying that dressing a certain way or wanting to feel beautiful is a bad thing. But if that's your source, your modus operandum, if that's what is you are looking for, living for, oh man, you are going to be sorely disappointed and constantly unhappy. And the problem is success as the world defines it is not a problem. The cause, what happens because of it is dissatisfaction. That is where depression comes in.
Yeah,
That is
I was
where our
talking to somebody
pain
with this
comes
whole.
in.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No
Yeah, I was
worries.
talking to somebody with this whole COVID thing and shelter in place, and they've been in, for several months,
Right.
and they're saying, "Man, I miss shopping because that was therapy. That's where I get happy. I buy something, I feel better." And
Right.
I've been cooped up for 4 months, and it's been really difficult. I've had sad thoughts, right? And it's interesting, right? It's a sort of a therapeutic remedy, but it's true. I think we have conditioning. We have things that have always brought us happiness, and for some people, it could be, haircut, getting your hair done, your nails done, whatever it may be.
Absolutely.
And for those people, that is a sense of wealth and health and well-being.
Right. You know what? It's the it's kind of like if you your one of your cards expires, you have a credit card that expires, and then all of a sudden you start seeing all these like delinquencies of all these subscriptions you didn't even know you had. And that's what a lot of people are saying right now with COVID. They're like, everybody's emailing, all these companies are emailing saying, hey, we're here with you with COVID. All of a sudden you're like, I didn't even know I was subscribed to that. Cancel, cancel, cancel. You don't even realize all the subscriptions you had. In a lot of ways, what we've done is we've subscribed to beliefs that are not ours. And COVID-19 and the pandemic and what the world has gone through right now, where we are forced to come to grips with reality, what it does is it puts us in a place where we're just saying, whoa, all the things I used to be subscribed to, all the therapies that I used to be subscribed to are not there. And so I am forced to deal with myself. Now, like you mentioned before, alcohol prices have soared. I mean, or the purchase of alcohol has soared because people are like, I need to find a new therapy. But this is actually a powerful opportunity for us to begin to meditate and center and learn to find satisfaction in our own existence. When I get stressed, I can listen to the palm trees outside and I can say, right now, in this very moment, everything is perfect. My heart is beating. My cells are doing what they're supposed to. The weather, the planet, the sun, everything is where it needs to. I'm okay. And when you get to that place and you can keep yourself there, then you won't need these external therapies that everybody's going for. Then you won't need to be jealous of the successes of other people. You'll learn to realize that there are billions of people who would kill, like literally kill, to have your problems in your life. Right?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting when you think about this time and what people are going through and perspectives, and I think it really does have the opportunity to reshape the value system of what we hold dear. But nonetheless, it does create a lot of stress, because if you can't process through it, and these are your anchor points that brought you happiness and joy at some level,
Right.
I think that's sort of that ongoing sort of friction between what is today and what used to be. And I remember someone told me one time, it's what you had or what you lost that you miss. If you had a time in your life that was so powerful, so amazing, that you're anchored in, that time that you felt very confident, or you could take on the world, and now that's gone for any number of reasons, it's always looking back at that point in time of what you had versus what you have today. And I think that's true with COVID. We had a lot of things, and for some people, they've lost their job, their savings, the relationships, because this has been very stressful. A lot of relationships, as I've talked to people. So the self-talk, you mentioned a very powerful statistic. 85% of the time, or what we think about as a negative self-talk, and I got to believe that COVID and these riots have just amplified that to the almost orders of magnitude, I should say plural, as to what they were. But the next question I have is, how can one minimize self-talk? And I've come across certain sort of recipes that I've read about, which is catch the critic, right? thoughts and feelings are not reality, and give
Right.
that inner critic a nickname like Debbie Downer, right?
Right.
Or
Right.
shift perspective. So, in your research, what can we do to minimize the negative self-talk?
Yeah. You know what? One of the things that consistently popped up as extremely important is self-awareness. And they kind of tie to some of the things that you're talking about, the catching the critical thinking, giving it a name. And I've talked about all this stuff in my programs. If you don't know how often a thing is happening, it's kind of that frog in the boiling water. If it's happening slow enough, you just think it's normal until it's too late, right? Capturing your thoughts, capturing your negative thoughts is one of the most powerful ways to be able to understand how much you berate yourself. If you knew how evil your thoughts are towards yourself, you would be disgusted by it. Every one of my clients are always disgusted by it because we spend 2 weeks. I have a form that I have them fill out. I created that and I have them fill it out as soon as they have a negative thought. And what they say is, this is what happened. This is what I thought about it. And this is how I felt afterwards. This person said this. It made me think that I suck at this. And it made me feel embarrassed, ashamed, depressed, sad. When you compile that for 2 weeks and you see the amount of negative statements that you say to yourself, you will be disgusted. And that's what the purpose of and the goal is of my work. It's I need you to see how bad you are to you. Because you think you just have a problem with getting up in the morning. You think you just have a problem with managing your employees. No, you have a problem with you. And when you see how much negativity you say to yourself, you become disgusted. And that point of disgust is where we use the motivation to get you to make changes. You have to see how bad it is. That becoming aware is the most powerful thing.
So,
Then
Brooke,
once
I
we,
have a question.
yeah, go ahead, man.
Bring up a great point. So,
Mhm.
as I've seen people, whether they're in power positions or they have a lot of responsibility, their head starts to spin about what? The future. That's where
Right.
stress comes from. And the idea of projection, talk to us about how impactful projecting can become. So, for example, someone's going through a divorce, and then
Okay.
their mind starts to spin like, well, if this happens, then financially this will happen. And then this will happen with my kids. And then my kids will be in front of their stepdad or their stepmom, and I can't bear that. And all of a sudden, they have this incredible
Right.
projection ahead of them of what's going to be, creating just epic amount of stress. So,
Right.
talk to us about how projection plays a role in sort of fomenting that negative self-talk.
You know, it's funny. I was leading right into that because I had both these two thoughts, and it's so perfect that you actually were talking about the projection. Because when I'm saying that, first things first is we see the negative thoughts that we have that we're projecting on ourselves, right? Then there's the second thought, which is the projection into the future. Now, something that separates humans from the animals, kind of our greatest skill set and biggest weakness, is our ability to remember chronologically and then also imagine. It's our imagination in the future. And to be honest, even memory for us is more of an imagination because we don't remember things exactly as they happen. We remember a narrative and we keep that, and then we also have our imagination of the future. One of the biggest problems about people is that they take their negative experiences from the past that have taught them how to live, and then they shuffle it into their projections of the future. And that's why they have anxiety, because they're worried about all the potential realities of what could happen. When you're projecting, what's happening is I call it script writing. You're writing a script. You do not know what will happen. But what happens is when you write a script, it becomes your reality. When it becomes your reality, then you must live by the script. If I think that this person will think this and say that, and they're going to talk about me over there, and the reason that person looked at me was this way, then what are we going to do? We're going to live as though that's true. And so we'll avoid this conversation. When that person looks at me, I'm going to go back to my negative thoughts that tell me that I'm not worthy. And so what happens is this insane cycle of our own creation. And only until we step out through mindfulness, only until we step out and look at it and analyze it, we become mindful, see, and then analyze, then can we realize how much BS it is. Then we can make it change. But until then, until you see the problem, understand that it's not real, then you will live in that ecosystem and not be able to survive.
Well said, man. I mean, I think it's so stressful for people that put this projective mindset in the reality in the
Right.
world. And I think one of the strategies I've come across has been most effective is have no expectations. And that doesn't mean you don't have goals, you're not pushing it hard every day, But
Right.
when I come across people, all I can do is control myself, my reaction, my response, how I treat that person. And beyond that, I have zero expectation of what I would expect from that person. Now, obviously, in business, we end
Yeah.
up lining ourselves up with people that'll help us be successful. We're doing things that are lined up around other people that are knowledgeable, have education.
Right.
But having said all that, I think an incredibly powerful strategy is when I deal with people in situations, I literally have no expectation. All I can control is what I can control. And believe me, I work like a mad dog to control it, to produce the best outcome.
Hmm.
But beyond that, I don't project that on other people to say, well, I expect you to do this, right? Or I expect you to do that. Because that's where I think that the whole head game starts to begin, right?
Mm.
Because you expected X, you got Y. Wasn't I good enough in doing the deal? Didn't I say the right things? Don't they get it? Are they biased? Are they prejudiced? Whatever goes on in our heads. And so the idea of not having and holding, maybe put another way, don't hold on to those expectations. It's just really going in there, presenting yourself genuinely, authentically. This
Right.
is who I am, and executing with all your skill set at a very high level. Just like in your business, when you're working with clients, you're in there producing the most authentic Berke
Right.
and what you have to offer, and you're laying it out there. And some people will sign up, and some people will resonate with, and some people just aren't there in that maturity continuum to really grasp what it is you're offering.
Yeah. I love this. And I love the addendum that you made. It's not holding on to those expectations. I think, a good friend of mine always said, you can only be disappointed by your expectations. And I'm like, that's absolutely 100%. That's true. If we set impossible or too high expectations on ourselves or others, we harm ourselves, right? Because we're holding on to them. What I say is the goal is, it's not so much, there's no problem holding an expectation. It's the grasping of an expectation. It's this must happen, right? When it must happen, then you're lost because your happiness is now predicated upon this happening or not happening. That's too much power to give anything. I hold my power, right? So at the end of the day, what I say is hold, but don't grasp, date, but don't marry, right? Like that's kind of what we're saying. When you're trying to make these type of changes,
Right.
I'm dating, I'm recording, but I'm not married to this. I'm not married that this is the way that it has to happen, right? When it comes to sales, of course, there is no expectation. My expectation is that I'm going to talk to this many people. I set my goals based on numbers, right?
Right.
As opposed to yeses and nos, right? Because what happens is I know that it's a numbers game. That frees me from being emotionally caught up with the no. Wait, I'm supposed to get, 3 sales out of 10 and I've had 11 and I've only had 2. What does that say about me? It's like, no, sometimes the numbers, they skew a little bit, but your averages. You just keep doing what you're supposed to do. Now that's okay. You hold, you don't grasp. Now in a managerial position or as a leader, when I'm working with people, when I'm working with my employees, when I'm working with people that I'm kind of helping or supporting and managing, my mentor used to say this, is that a manager, their only job is to manage promises. It's not to manage expectations and what's supposed to happen and make sure they do them and beat them if they don't. You say, do you promise to do this? You set the promise. And if they say, I promise, then if they don't do it, all you do is you're saying, hey, there's disintegrity here. As your manager, I need to manage that promise. Did you bite off more than you could chew? A, or did something come up? All I have to do is just say, what's up? What happened? Not saying you didn't do what you're supposed to do and you disappointed my expectations, but I'm managing promises. And so at the end of the day, when we get to a place, instead of expecting things, we're just managing promises. It frees us from being mad at the outcome, but seeing what we can fix in the promising so that our outcomes more are in alignment with our expectations.
Right. Yeah, that's tricky with managers, right? Because they're paid and they're promoted based on execution and getting outcomes and controlling the results. So it's not that you always don't have the expectations and don't, hold on to them. You got to have standards and expectations, but a lot of times those same expectations end up doing us more harm than good. So another, as we look at the series, another massive habit in the failure zone, as I would call it, is gossiping about others, right? I think as Eleanor Roosevelt once said, great minds discuss ideas, average mind discusses events, and small minds discuss people, right?
Mm,
And
yeah.
so I think the motivation to gossip is fueled by underlying it all insecurity at some level. Many of us mistakenly think that if others are wrong, bad, or fault ridden, then in comparison, I must be good, I must be right, I must be capable. And it's
Yeah.
always that comparison game of whether it be ethnicity, groups, wars, battles. We want to always compare ourselves to others to feel better, as if the other person is the standard. And
Right.
you don't know that person. They may be looking at you as a standard, right? And so the whole idea of insecurity and what motivates us. So In your research, in your experience, what are some of the effects of gossiping on ourselves and in our relationships?
Yeah, I despise gossip, man. And I love that quote: ideas, events, and people. Just anecdotally, I can't stand a gossip. My mind is saying, if this is what you chose to talk about, out of all the things in your mind, in your brain, all the billions of thoughts that are in your brain, and this is the one that you think is the most important to talk about, it just gives me an idea of where you're at. And what I say is that if you need to push someone down to get up, then you never can get up. Like, you never can climb. Your existence is just, it's almost wasteful. And I feel that this idea of comparison, now competitive, I 100%, I love it. I love competition. But when it's comparison, one is, it shows your own insecurities, that I must be better than this person in order to feel better. If I say that I must be better than this person to feel better, then that really means that I think that person's better,
Mm-hmm.
because they're the measuring stick onto which my betterness is. And if let's say I do the thing that makes me better than them, then what's the next thing I'm going to do? I'm going to look up to the next thing. So that means my entire life is chasing the tail of somebody else. It's insane to me that a person could even do that. But to move on and talk about events, or move on to what I love to talk about, ideas, man, that's where power is. That's where all of a sudden you're at a place where mentally you're like, what can I create? There's this awesome picture. It was Michael Phelps. He was swimming, and I forgot. I think it was one of the top swimmers from France during the Olympics. They were swimming for the gold, and the picture had the Frenchman looking to see where Michael Phelps was, and Michael Phelps was looking towards the gold. And the picture is just, and it says, greatness doesn't look to check where it is. It doesn't compare. It just chases its goal. And so ultimately, if we don't want to be failures in life, we have to know what we're about. Because if all that we're defining ourselves is by Instagram, is by looking at the television, is by thinking that a number amount will make us something great, then we are sorely mistaken.
Yeah, it's a good point, because sadness, depression, stress, anxiety sort of is tied in, as if we compare ourselves to other. I know the Bible talks about this. Don't do it, right? And the Bible says one of the fastest ways of discouraging yourself and getting trapped by the sin, as it would call it, of envy, is when you compare yourself to others. And the reality is, we're all given different gifts under the sun. I believe in God, and God's bestowed us with different gifts. Maybe the ability to orate, maybe the ability to be an athlete, or scientific, or math. And the idea, or we've talked about this before, super ultra beautiful people. You look on TikTok and they got a bunch of supermodels on there, right?
Right.
And they're prancing around as if they've done something. The reality is, that's a gift. Everybody has a gift, and it invites us to be super humble. But the idea of comparing our gifts to somebody else's gifts that they were given, and maybe they developed it. And there's also that aspect of, there's a lot of luck,
Right.
in success in business, as I've seen it, timing, people you come across at the right time, right place. And so the idea of comparing ourselves to others is really misguided in my experience, because it really doesn't serve the gifts you've been given. And it doesn't really help you see those gifts necessarily, because if we're thinking, I need to be, have a lot of money or have this attribute, without fully looking at the attributes of what God's given you,
Right.
boy, there's a big missed opportunity. And I think ultimately the biggest happiness in life, right, is to be able to express your talent. That's what you do every day, Berke. You're able to get out there and connect, touch, impact people with your talent. Imagine if you would have still pursued singing and maybe never pursued this.
Right. Right.
I just see you had the ability to pivot, but yet you're able to, in your own right, say, this is who I am. These are my gifts. And that temptation to compare, as you said it best, the media wants that comparison. Hey, look at the house this guy has. Look at the car this guy has. You should get that. So what do people do? They go out there and just stretch the heck out of their credit, right?
Yeah.
And when there's a downturn, they lose their house, their car, and the rest goes with it. So
yeah, it's interesting. You said something that was really interesting that I want to point on, and that was great, is that you said, this is my talents, these are my gifts. And the reason I love that, and I want to hone in on that, is because that knowledge is so rare. This is my talent, these are my gifts. Just being able to understand that is what makes people free enough to decide what they want to be, because they don't know their talents and their gifts. They don't know what it is that they're about. Then they lose everything. Einstein said everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll live its whole life thinking it's stupid. If you don't know what your skill set is, then you cannot find out how to come alive in the world. And so finding those 2 points, these are my talents and these are my gifts. When you have that, then you can create something incredible.
Oh, it's well said. It's really important too, just for mental health and performance and success. So another habit in the failure zone that we've identified certainly is holding on to the past. That's a big one for a lot of people, right? And if you have
Right.
one foot in the past and one foot in the future, you're pissing all over the present. I think a lot of people do that. This is all we've got right now is the present. This is where we can make magic
Right.
happen. This is where we can make the biggest changes in our life for the future, learning from the past, right? Learning
Mhm.
from those experiences. So, right, the thing about holding on to the past is it doesn't allow you to move on. You're stuck, right? Because every bit of your energy that you're using to hold on to the past is a bit of energy you don't have to move forward. And most people hold on to those events that they've judged to have a very strong negative event in their past, right? So
Right.
whether it be relationships or a lost job or something that was said to you, it could just be that 1 billion pound anchor around your neck. So
Mm.
how does holding on to the past limit one's effectiveness and happiness in your experience?
Right. The past, if it's not a lesson, then it's an anchor. If the past is not a lesson, it's an anchor, even if it was a good thing in the past. If something great happened in the past and you don't use it as a lesson or a reminder of something, then all of a sudden it becomes an anchor because you're thinking what you want the future to be or what you want the present to be. Like, it's not what it was, right? But if it's trauma, it becomes an anchor because it can't be what I want it to be because of what happened back then. And so what happens is this ability to grasp, to marry, without holding, without looking with curiosity. One of my mentors always called it the caring, curious listener, CCL. The past is just a reminder and a guide for your present. Because if you look at the past, you can say, okay, let me just look at what happened. Let me really dissect it. Let me become a caring, curious listener. I'm not going to make a judgment on it. I'm not going to make a judgment on who I was for doing what I did, but I'm just going to look at it. And by looking at it and analyzing it, I can say, what lessons can I learn from this? How can it make my present better so that I can make my future better? When you dwell on the past, you live in the past. When you live in the past, you live in an illusion because it's not the past, it's your narrative of the past. Again, it's your projection of what happened. All that happens in the world is what happens. The narrative about it is what humans do. We're meaning-making machines. So we're living in a memory, which is a ghost, and it's our narration of that memory, which is a double ghost. So we're living in a non-real double illusion, not able to exist in the present moment. How in the world can you experience or create anything good in the present when you're in this space? All we do is hold, look, analyze, learn with caring, curiosity, and listen. And then we set it down and then become present. The future is the same thing. We grasp the future. It's a ghost in itself. And then we create a narrative of what it could be and worry and anxious. Then again, we've lost our present. And the greatest strength of humans, like I said, is memory and imagination. But until we can get our memory to see a beautiful story of the past that taught us lessons and imagine a beautiful story of the future, that no matter what happens, we'll be centered in who we are, then we can have a beautiful story right now.
Yeah, you got those bookends of depression and anxiety, the past, the future,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Hopelessness, right? And it's amazing how many people get stuck in that story at some point in their life, at some juncture. They
Mm.
keep going right back to that story to define who they are today.
Mm.
And that's why we talked about this. You could talk to somebody who's literally on the 65th lesson of the same lesson. You've talked to them many times and you said, hey, here's some course corrections you may want to consider. Here's some things you could consider that may be more effective. And they're right back to the same habits and patterns in that story they tell themselves. And for
Yeah.
some reason, they can't get out of that story. I remember listening to Tony Robbins one time, and he said, I've never lost somebody who was suicidal. And he'd get with somebody who's suicidal, and they're in that way. They're in that mindset. They're thinking about the past and going down that rabbit hole. And all of a sudden, he'd say, bright light. He'd just say something totally abstract.
Right.
And all of a sudden, guess what happened to their mood and their state? It would shift like that.
Right.
And all of a sudden, they're like, what? And then they're thinking of a bright light. How they feeling now? Totally shifted. So the idea of what we think, the power of our thoughts. There's lots of books written on it.
Yeah.
It's so powerful what we think about. And I would argue some people like to be there at some level because maybe they feel they deserve it. Maybe they don't feel they're good enough. Maybe they feel like they should be punished their whole life. But the ultimate outcropping, Berke, I would argue, is it doesn't allow you to move on in an effective way, in a happy, healthy way. And so if you look at what's going on in the world today, and it's very tragic. I would argue there's a lot of people in those movements that are not happy. For in grasp on the obvious, the audience would say, but they're fundamentally not happy, and they
Yeah.
can't see a world full of promise, brilliance. Like look at Elon Musk, right? He's a big ideas thinker. He's not gossiping about people.
Mm-hmm.
He's thinking big league, right?
Right.
And you say, how does he see the world? What does he see when he looks at the world? And did he have some privilege? Maybe he did at some level, but if you read his story, it was self-made.
Mm.
So then you say, well, how do you get to some level of that perspective? And it
Yeah.
seems to me that if you don't start to work, from where it all started for you, that story you tell yourself,
Right.
you'll never get there, unfortunately. But I would
Yeah.
argue
Mm-hmm.
there is a story that's brilliant, that's massive, that's passionate, that's hopeful, that's
Yeah.
there. To tap into it is the opportunity.
Yeah. It's so true. The way you perceive a thing is the way it is, period.
Yeah.
And, even Elon Musk, he's talked about his depression and his anxiety and what he's experienced. And I feel like there needs to be a new redefinition of success. I feel that there needs to be a redefinition of what success is, because success can be attained whether you have $10,000 in your bank account, 1,000, -50, or $1 billion. Success is an internal process. It's you aligning with your values. It's finding what your talents are and expressing and sharing them in the world. And I think what happens is we've defined success to be something so difficult to achieve, such as making $1 million or being a billionaire, that we kind of eradicate most of society, because society has bought in on the belief that this is what the definition of success is. If I want to be a family man and I want to teach children, I can be a teacher on a $35,000 salary, you know what I mean, that can find happiness. I can. And people can disagree with me till the cows come home, but I can. And so really what we have to do is we have to redefine what success is. That's kind of one of the main things that I do in my work. When I was teaching at Cal, my course was about how do we redefine what success is. I had kids who came in and they're like, my parents only told me that success is me being a doctor. I have to get a 4.0. Here, this is what I must do. And as we're taking this course, people are realizing this is not who they are. I had a student who literally quit school for a semester and did music. Now, I'm sure his parents would have hated me. But what's crazy is his SoundCloud went from 0 to 30,000 followers. Mm-hmm. Then he went back to school and was able to manage both of them together. And I remember we walked by on campus and he goes, thank you so much, because I never would have questioned otherwise. I never would have questioned.
It's beautiful. It's what you reminded me last week. Remember you talked about identities, and you got to have multiple identities so you don't have an identity crisis. So I'm working on maybe becoming a doctor, then I'm working on my music, and then I work on another sort of structure to my foundation, right? Very, very important, that idea. But you brought up something that made me realize, Fiji the island, and Fiji water comes from Fiji the island. If you go to parts of the island, then there's some really nice Tony areas where there's the resorts, but on the average part of the island that's really impoverished, mm-hmm. If you go there, they're among the happiest people on planet Earth. They have nothing. You can see that, again, around the world. You can go to indigenous populations. They have nothing. They have family. They have connection. And they're just absolutely happy. I think the most stressed out people on the planet are in capitalistic, first world sort of societies. It is stressful. There's a lot you got to juggle, right? And for a lot of us, we don't necessarily have families around. This is a culture that you move to Chicago, you go to New York, and you don't have that support structure. So what do people rely on? I mean, it used to be family support, right?
So real.
And then it sort of emerged as something different.
You hit it right on the head, man. One absolute 100%, man. When I was in Bali and I met the Balinese, I mean, the most grateful, happy. They would have these flowers that were blessings, kind of grateful flowers that they would place on their motorcycles. They place on the cars. They place on the floor. They place in their houses, and it was just this constant gratitude, incense-filled gratitude for everything. When they asked you how you're doing, they're like, "How are you?" And I'm like, "I'm good." They're like, "Oh, how?" I'm like, "What do you mean how? I already told you I'm good." They wanted to know the communication, the connection, the way that the family showed up, the way that people found happiness. I did volunteer work in Honduras. And these kids, they had rotten teeth. We were doing dental work with them, and we were taking blood and all this different stuff. But they were the happiest kids I've ever seen. A lot of times people say they didn't know they were poor until they left that space. They didn't know what poverty was until they understood capitalism. Just as darkness defines light, right? The material world defines loss. poverty. But poverty is wealth if you have family, if you have connection. And so it's so often that we forget, we define the wrong thing. Anxiety is shooting through the roof as material is being accrued at a higher level. Everything is backwards. And so if we can understand that enlightenment is a reductive process, that it's destructive in nature, that everything we thought that was is not what is, then we can gain freedom. But it'd be harder for us to get to that enlightened space than somebody who's in a impoverished state already. Blessed are the poor, for they will see God.
Yeah, it's true. So that whole idea of holding on to the past, I sort of think about an analogy about, if you look back, right, and that's how you're moving forward, is you're always looking in the past. It's sort of like driving a car with your rearview mirror. It's really, really difficult, right?
Yeah, hard.
That's all you're looking at. And the idea that you can power forward, what it means is you're going to hit other obstacles, other things that'll befall you because you weren't looking forward. You weren't seeing some of the obvious signs in potholes, roadblocks, whatnot. So, man, is it important not to look backwards, but really, live in the present, look forward. But and the last sort of, I'd say, habit of failure that I sort of came across was stressing about the future. Again, we talked about the past, the present, the future. But in flying, there's a maxim that says, fly ahead of the aircraft. When you fly a jet aircraft, it's going so bloody fast as compared to a prop like a 172 Cessna, that you have to have a checklist in your head where you're 5 to 10 steps ahead of what the plane's going to do or be at a certain point, right? And we are taught that, to have a vision, a dream, which will always put us in the future, right? We're always thinking about, what do you want to do in the future? I'm going to go to school. I'm going to become a doctor. Then maybe I'll become an attending as a neurosurgeon or cardiac surgeon or whatever, right?
Right.
We always have this forward-looking, view of things. But however, I'd argue this can create a lot of extreme stress, as we've talked about. And I'd say it's the number one cause of stress, the whole future thing. I mean, look at COVID and what's going on, and look at the riots. People are saying, what does the future of the country look like? Do I feel safe? Is my job safe? Is everything I built my construct on safe, right? So it's this whole future projection, right? So based on your experience, right, what are some of the solutions to prevent us from stressing about the future? What are some things you could help us with to think about just staying in the present? And when we see things that have future implications, we can process them in a quality way.
Yeah. The best way to not focus on the future or worry about it is to be present. And that's a hard thing to tell people to do. But people think present means be here. And then they imagine their computers and they imagine the news and they imagine social media and they imagine so many things. But when I say be here, I say be here. And if I look at, like I said earlier, the trees swaying in the breeze, my heartbeat, feeling the pulse in my fingers, all of a sudden you start to realize that I am okay. Right? What about the future? What about the future? Yeah, you can choose to not be okay in this moment by thinking about something that's not now. But until you get good at being here, you can't deal with there. Because just as these future potential problems are in the future, you can't transport to the future to fix them. So for you to waste any bit of your cognitive space thinking about something that you cannot control, you rob yourself of this right here. And when people are able to center themselves and take time to really just realize that they are okay now, just as they were worried about the future 2 months ago, here they are in the future, now present, still alive and okay and figuring it out. And if they can trust that they'll be still alive, okay, and figuring it out, then it allows them to say, then what can I do now? Now that I can take this partition of my brain that has been used worrying, I can now use 100% of my mind to deal with the problems at hand, right? And that's the issue. Most people think that by worrying about the future, they're reducing its prospects of danger. Nothing changes. In fact, it gets worse, most likely because they're not doing the work that they need to do now. Right. The future is powerful. The only way that I'll look into the future is if I visualize and virtualize and imagine a beautiful future. I imagine myself smiling. I imagine myself happy. I imagine myself with my family. I imagine myself making money. I imagine all I'm going to do. The only time that I'll go into the future is if it's just bright with positivity, because then what I can do is I can take that joy and I can add it to this present moment to create it. But there's no way that I will take worry from something that's not happening and bring it here and then weigh it on me to where I'm even more paralyzed and I can't make change. I'm only going to take joy from the future.
So certainly stress is not a solution, right? So what are the effects of stressing out? I mean, your clinical research, what are some
Yeah.
of the effects of when people are just living in an abject, seriously
Right.
stressed out state?
Yeah. So I can explain from my research is this, you realize that drop, right? You go from optimist to pessimist to crisis of meaning. Can I do it? And then when you're at the can I do it, your core beliefs of I am not capable, I'm not worthy of love, I'm not successful. These are beliefs deeply set inside you that just kind of swallow you and make you give up. Then when you give up, it takes time for you to be like, okay, I've punished myself enough. Now it's time to start this cycle over again. And that's kind of what happens. But when it comes to more of a physiological level in this space, what happens is we're anxious because we're having an identity crisis. We're anxious because our core fears about who we really are and how we're not worthy start to come to reality because we're sabotaging ourselves. We're missing deals. We're missing phone calls. We're not making things happen right. We're not losing weight. We're not quitting the smoking. We're eating bad. What happens is on a physiological level, our cortisol levels go up. It's a stress hormone. And when our cortisol levels go up, we start to have difficulty thinking as well. Our sleep is reduced, right? But if our sleeping is reduced, then it becomes even more difficult to think. Our cognition becomes less clear. Our ability to plan, our ability to strategize, our ability to use our rational mind goes down. We start reverting to our hindbrain, our limbic system, where fight or flight becomes somebody says something and we're triggered more easily. We say things we don't mean to say. And what happens is somebody else who's stressing gets that trigger, they're triggered back to give it back, which creates this feedback loop, which brings us back further, further, and further. The reason that I do all the work that I do is to increase the odds of you using your front brain. That's it. Because if I can get you to use your front brain and become more mindful, then we can make choices to make a better life. The problem is when we're stressed, we go back. When we go back, we don't make proper decisions. We don't take risks. We don't put ourselves in positions where we can have to use emotional intelligence. We're reactive. And all that is a perfect recipe for expedited failure. And so the most important thing to understand is that when you get to that crisis of meaning, this is when you meditate. This is where you come back to center. This is where you find out what's really going on. Let me look at my past and look with mindfulness and carrying curiosity. Let me listen and take that as a lesson. Oh, and I'm worried about the future. Let me turn my future into a beautiful image of future. And if I can't do that, then what I'll do is I'll remember times that I thought things were going to go bad and they went well. And I'll be like, just like that happened in the past, I trust that'll happen in the future. All I care to do is to create the space for you to be present, to do the best work you can to create the best life possible. But if you take from the future, pull from the past, and add worry, you cannot do that. And that's how you gain failure.
Sounds like a hot mess.
Yeah, it is, man. It's just, all we're doing is inverting
Yeah.
the mess. Because if
Yeah.
you do the opposite of that mess, that's what's so great about my work. I find out why are we like this? Okay, what if we did the opposite? Then it creates the space to be successful.
Yeah, stress out is not a good place to live. I mean, it increases disease. We know that. It
Right.
screws up relationships, kills creativity, ability to work effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, you don't get sleep. And I was reading the other week that worse than alcohol is not enough sleep. That'll kill you quicker than alcohol, believe it or not. So sleep's really vital.
Huge.
Making sure our mind's alert, well rested, and all this stuff is sort of building blocks, right? The idea of I don't stress about the future and I don't look too far in the past really means you got to have sort of a holistic approach to who you are and what makes you tick and being aware. I think a lot of people go through life unaware of who they really are. That what they are is a sort of a compilation of the layers they put on, maybe the makeup or the look or the clothes or the car or the house. But really who they are is probably maybe a scary proposition. But boy, I think that's where the secret to success really lies, where you don't really care about what people think and you really are focused and honed in on your skills, your passions, of ultimately what brings you happiness and peace. And trying to find it out there in this world
Mm.
is really, really different. I think there's from that just failure zone after failure zone that we sort of that traps we get into, and sometimes it's self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. If not always, you know what I mean? It's what you focus on. I remember when I was younger, I was riding a bike. I was learning to ride a bike. My dad was telling me, like, wherever you look, you're going to go. And I'm like, I don't want to hit that pole. What do I do? I'm going to hit that pole. That's what happened. He's
Right.
like, look where you want to go. Don't look where you don't want to go. And it's the same for all of us. We have to look where we want to go. And the only way to do that is to just turn out all the poles, all the poles in our mind and just turn them off and say, where am I trying to go? And then you'll start riding in that direction.
That's a good point. Turn it all off, right? Because we're going to social media or wherever we're going for our information. Sometimes you need that quiet solace place or that solitude where you can really think clearly without all the clutter.
That's where the mornings are one of the most important thing. I'm creating this thing called Bulletproof Morning. It's an ebook that I'll be providing, but it's just my morning is my time of solitude. And it's where you turn off everything, all the inputs from the world, you center, you create your meditation, your affirmation, your process. So when you come out of the womb of your bedroom, you are ready to take on the world because you haven't been incited by the thoughts, events, ideas, and things on the outside world. Therefore, you're creating the energy that you want to produce in the world. By and far, so much more powerful way to live.
Beautifully said, Berke. Another great session, man.
Absolutely. Always been. This is great, man. I'm loving it.
Loved it. Till next time, really enjoyed the conversation.
Same, man.
All right.